back. Sometimes I don't speak the best. Yeah. Can I get mic'd up? I don't want to break the mic.
This one goes. Let's see, this one goes. That's the ground, yeah. This will probably go. I always put it in a pocket.
Does that help? How do I turn it?
I think it's on. It should be on.
Okay. Can you hear me better now? Can you hear me now?
Looks like it's on, right?
Yeah, how do we turn up the volume?
Oh, maybe it needs to be on your tie. Try putting it on your tie. Yeah.
Is that better? Is that better?
Can you hear us now?
Okay. Everyone can hear me all right? Not too loud, not too soft? Okay. All right, first of all, thank you all for taking the time. I know it's a Friday, so I'm sure all of you want to get out of here. So thank you all for taking the time. Before I start, at the end I have my acknowledgements, but I really want to thank HHDRC. They do an amazing thing for just a range of people, and they've helped me out so much, and I can't thank them enough. So, really great people, and I can't thank them enough for letting me come down here and talk about this. This is important to me. I think it's important to help people. So basically, I'm going to sort of be mixing a couple of things. A lot of times, you hear about PTSD a lot, post-traumatic stress disorder. And oftentimes, I think people aren't familiar with what that actually entails. Some people maybe more than others, so please don't feel like I'm being patronizing. But I just want to start out this presentation with giving just a little bit of background if you're not familiar with how we sort of codify PTSD. And that transitions into something that we have to consider that's a little bit more nuanced here on the border. And unfortunately, many other areas of the world, but oftentimes they lack the research infrastructure to study it, which is sort of this ongoing form of traumatic stress. And this is really new in the literature, actually. So for the science community, considering this ongoing thing is really new. It's only starting to show up very recently, and most of the work has come out of Israel because that's one of the few places where there's an infrastructure. This particular talk is going to pertain to people who are affected on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border here, there's going to be we'll have to generalize a little, but basically trying to relate these things to what's going on in Ciudad Juarez, unfortunately, and other areas of Mexico. So with that, the agenda, brief background on both, and then go into the preliminary study that I was able to do with a lot of help, including HHDRC's help, with those exposed to the violence. Certainly, when we're done with this presentation, I want your opinion, because I don't have all the right answers. I'm a gringo from South Dakota. I love it down here, but I don't have all the insights, so I very much welcome your feedback. And then I'm going to also talk about considerations for mental health here in the U.S.-Mexico border, public health and safety communities. If I could get people to raise their hand, if you're in like public, or you're like in corrections or probation, things like that. Okay, and then people who are sort of in the medical community, and then mental health in some way. And let's see, are there other areas that you feel like I'm missing? Because I actually want to try and be a little thinking on my toes.
We have children that come to our Boys and Girls Club.
Okay.
Boys and Girls Club is Segundo Barrio.
Okay.
And a lot of them go back and forth.
Okay, right on. So a range of community organizations here, or government organizations. So I'll try and adapt it a little bit, think on my feet there. But before we start that, I just want to present, first thing I did when I first came down here is go over into Ciudad Juarez. I really like Ciudad Juarez. Some people not so much, but I really like a lot of things that happen there, especially before the violence. But this is now what's going on, and I chose the less gruesome. So obviously there's tons of things that could be gruesome. I didn't put them up here for the very reason that can be disturbing. But you can see that there's almost a feeling of occupation. So And this is just the minor stuff. So with that in mind, getting a traumatic stress background, really, I want to frame it in what we call, I guess, you would hear it as much as I do, violence and insecurity. When conflicts arise, we often develop a name to describe just the general situation state. In different areas of the world develop different terms. For example, in Northern Ireland, it's always collectively referred to as the Troubles. So whenever someone says the Troubles, people know, oh yeah, all that stuff. Well, here it seems to be shaping up as violence and insecurity. La violencia y la inseguridad. And unfortunately, all too many of us are probably familiar with all the things happening. And the important thing, especially now, is the U.S. isn't immune. Things like what's happening in Clinton. All the surrounding communities, violence, extortion, kidnapping on both sides of the U.S.-Mexico border. Even as far as, Phoenix has got a huge kidnapping problem. So the U.S. isn't immune, and I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir when I say that both sides of the border are affected. More broadly in the north, people, it's sort of out of sight, out of mind. Well, just build a wall. And it's maybe a little bit more nuanced without getting into that today. In any case, it increases stress, and particularly extreme stress. And so, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Association, and then also in the ICD-9 and ICD-10, they map all those pretty well. To give you a little bit of background about how it's codified, post-traumatic stress disorder and then also acute stress disorder, they fall under the anxiety disorders, and we heard a little bit about that before. And you have to be exposed to a trauma, but as I'll go into in a little bit, it's a little bit subjective about what constitutes trauma. But once you're exposed, you have to experience these feelings of fear, helplessness, horror, and immediate aftermath, the peri-event. So those are really triggers to say this is kind of indicative that there might be a problem later, that fear, helplessness, and horror. Then, later on, shortly thereafter to maybe you can have delayed incidents of where you develop these core symptoms. And they really are, they fall into sort of these three categories of intrusive thoughts or re-experiencing. So if you think about those nightmares and flashbacks, things like that, often people describe as slow motion re-experiencing of the events. That's the intrusive thoughts, that's the re-experiencing. Then you have the avoidance and numbing the situations. So people start to avoid the situations because they don't want to experience it. Examples of that would be not wanting to talk about it. With World War II, many people, they passed away, they never talked about the war after they came back. There's a reason for that. It's part of the avoidance of it. And it makes sense. It's in many ways adaptive. When you experience something negative, you don't want to think about it, and having to talk about it means you have to think about it. There's a variety of symptoms. And then also people, the discussions prior in the morning about combat veterans, sort of those numbing feelings, just sort of like sort of depersonalization, derealization in some cases. But you get this numbing. You're just not a part of things. And that's, in the immediate aftermath of a negative event, it's actually kind of adaptive for the body to not want to be a part of that because you have to experience it less. And then the third core symptom is these hyperarousal symptoms. So autonomic arousal in general, the beating heart, the sweating, things like that when you start thinking about situations like that. And you have to have a number of certain symptoms, and then you have to have psychosocial impairment. And that is sort of that's subjective to each individual. And one of the points I want to make here, especially with the conflict in pseudoaquatics, is it's not just clinicians. We have these scales, and we have these scales, and then also the diagnostic criteria. And that gives you a nice cutoff. It gives you a yes, no. But oftentimes things aren't really this yes, no. And people who have what we might call partial PTSD, or some symptoms, but not these full criteria, in the literature we still find that they're affected in some degree. So it might not necessarily meet criteria, but it's still affecting people. And that's worth considering, especially when you consider some people in the area. I just want to talk about the implicit assumption which are valid for PTSD, but are a little bit more nuanced in the current situation. So if you have a traumatic event, and this is time, you go on, you develop PTSD, and you're sort of, the reality of the situation is you're sort of in these presumed safe situations. That's not always the case, but for example, if you're deployed, presumably when you return to the US, you're in a safe situation. So that's what's happening in PTSD, but you're generalizing the situation, and you're sort of turning inward and avoiding situations. Remember that a core symptom is avoidance. So individuals, they start to avoid a wide range of things. They avoid thinking about it, they avoid going out, things like that. Because they don't want to feel like they're being exposed, putting themselves in harm's way. And so it's this, I won't go too much into this, but basically it's trying to allow people, because, for example, in health psychology, we have this thing called the biopsychosocial model. Everything is combined. It's not just psychological, it's not just biological, it's not just social. They all intertwine. And the idea here is that people are generalizing all these things, and it's part of the help that we need to give for individuals who have been affected by traumatic stress. It's in part retraining the body to let it know that it's in a safe place. If you're in a safe place, assuming this is post-traumatic stress, post-trauma, and that's an implicit assumption. So I just want to talk a little bit about trends that have been identified in the literature. There's one extra one here that I won't talk too much, which is post-traumatic growth, because in the literature it's a little, some people say it's there, especially positive psychologists, and other people argue not. So I won't go into the detail, but these are well documented. So you have the chronic form, which is greater than 3 months. You have acute PTSD is how they codify it. And then you have what are called resistance and resilience. Now, just to go on, here's what chronic looks like. It never goes below a certain age. They're always suffering. Now, even in the DSM, it's saying, okay, if it's not 3 months, but it's greater than about a month, it's still acute PTSD. And if you think about, well, without going into too much detail about the DSM, there's still a lot of suffering that can be occurring even, when you have symptoms around here. So it's worth noting that. There is a certain part, also jumping back, in epidemiological studies, there are certain risk factors that increase your likelihood of developing PTSD. I'll talk about those in a minute. But the majority of people don't develop PTSD in the long term. It's a few individuals, unfortunately, when you have really horrible events like combat or sexual assault, that can predispose you to a higher likelihood. But in general, at the population level, the majority of people in both Mexico and the U.S. will be exposed to at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. But the majority don't develop PTSD. But obviously, for some situations, it's more likely. There's a certain group of the population that they never react. They're exposed, and this is where the subjectivity comes in. They never seem to react in a way that would be consistent with PTSD. And it's kind of an interesting group. It's not as common as perhaps the PTSD from an epidemiological standpoint. But the most common is when people are exposed to a traumatic event. It's almost adaptive how we as humans react. It's initially really negative, but eventually we're able to cope with it. We're able to put it in the right place in our minds, and sort of move on with our lives. And that's called resilience in the literature. And so it's building up the resilience. This is a really interesting group because that's what sort of the normal trend, what we would hope for. Unfortunately, when you have an ongoing situation, what if you're a resistant person? Keeping in mind, majority of people epidemiologically seem to have this resilience. But if you're constantly re-exposed, what happens? Now, going back to that, the implicit assumptions about post-traumatic stress is an event happens, an earthquake, deployment, you come back, you're in a safe place. Well, now, even in deployment, when they're having psychiatrists out who are deployed, they're having to sort of admit, and also the Veterans Health Administration in July of last year had to admit, okay, people are exposed multiple times, and I can't identify which one caused it, and it's probably because there are multiple things going on. So even people are resilient if they're constantly re-exposed. We don't have a good understanding of how this out in the long term because it's really hard to study. I just want to revisit this here, the core symptoms, to really understand PTSD. Hyperarousal, constant scanning, re-experiencing intrusive thoughts, and then the avoidance, the numbing. So to keep those in mind, those are core symptoms of traumatic stress. So it's also worth considering the peritraumatic part, and this is where we really find it difficult to study this, because if we knew a negative event were going to happen, we'd want to stop it. And in the current situation in Ciudad Juarez, we can't. And so it's worth considering some of the things that go on immediately. So peritraumatic events oftentimes involve these unpredictable and uncontrollable situations. And then you have the subjective reactions of fear, helplessness, and horror. And there are a variety of ways in which you can be exposed. You have the direct forms of trauma. So for example, sexual assault, any type of assault, a carjacking directly happening to you, some forms of terrorism, a bomb explodes, things like that, an IED, you yourself are shot, you're in a car accident. Car accidents are really common civilian forms of people develop PTSD from that, really horrible car accidents. So it's worth considering what's a direct form of trauma. There are also these indirect forms of trauma. Witnessing. There was a lot of study after 9/11 of people across the nation who were affected by what was going on in New York and Washington. To a degree that was significant. They had impairment. Now, thankfully, a lot of that subsided, but that was just through witnessing or through even media. Now, there's a lot of that in Ciudad Juarez. And then also you have, and it came up a little bit, and I went back and highlighted this, you have trauma by proxy. So someone else you know very closely is affected. So now you're affected. And the last point here is, I can't drive this home enough, is this subjective interpretation. I can see something and think it's absolutely horrible, the most horrifying thing I've seen in my life. And someone else in this room might go, okay, I can deal with that. That's not too bad. I can put it in the right place in my mind. Yeah, it's really horrible, but I'm okay. It's very subjective how people react. And so it's very difficult to say, yes, this is a trauma, and no, it isn't. Understandably, certain things, like if you've had to kill civilians and you're a soldier, you're deployed, you've seen death, you're assaulted in some form, obviously those things are very traumatic. But what other people find traumatic, there's some leeway. So we can't definitively say, yes, this was traumatic, no, this wasn't, because it's very subjective. As much as policymakers would maybe like that, it's difficult. And then you have the pre-trauma risk factors. Now, one of the strongest ones is female gender. Epidemiologically, it's female gender, and I'm going to come back to that. Low socioeconomic status is there too. Analytic studies, that combined studies is sort of like, if you have something that happens to you, like you're in an earthquake when you're young, then your parents die, then you're assaulted, things like that. There are these discrete events that happen, and they build up over time. So, and that's a risk factor. Pre-existing anxiety disorders or an anxiety sensitivity, those are also risk factors. As depression is sort of mixed, it's really unclear if it's a risk factor or if it just comes along with traumatic stress. Some people argue, well, it's the same thing, and they should be condensed. But as we'll see in the study I'll be presenting, that's not the case actually, and it might worsen traumatic stress, and traumatic stress might worsen depression, but the thinking is still clearly that they're distinct, but highly correlated. Now, what are some buffers to traumatic stress? Within the literature, the strongest effects are for social support, and you can see by what organizations here in town are doing with veterans in particular, that's a form of social support. I'll come back to that a lot. And coping, what can you do to cope? Well, in coping theories, one way to think about it is breaking up into what we call problem-focused coping, and then this active emotional-focused coping, and then avoidance coping, which is also an emotion-based coping strategy in a lot of ways. Problem-focused coping is when you think about you get into a lot of debt, credit card debt. You develop a plan to get out of debt. That's problem-focused coping. That is a little tricky in an uncontrollable and unpredictable situation. What do you do in those situations? And at the end of this presentation, there are creative ways in which people might be doing this already, and I'd love to hear some if you've heard of them. I'll talk a little bit about one that I thought was an example of problem-focused coping in serial pies. You might know of others because you know this situation as well, if not better than me. There's also the emotion-focused coping, and you have things like self-distraction. I have a friend, for example, in serial pies. She can no longer study in the U.S. She's over there. She was really depressed at first, but she really found some activities to participate in, and those are keeping her distracted from some of the, even though she's gone through a lot of really negative events related to the violence in serial pies. So self-distraction can be adaptive. It's this, or doing just different things. Behavioral, like it might also be behavioral. Venting is also positive in this light. Sort of processing, it oftentimes serves as a way of processing, and it's a way to avoid avoidance, that core symptom of traumatic stress. It's sort of a way of your mind processing. And the problem, of course, is that if you live in a situation where you want to vent, or someone around you wants to vent, and you don't want to hear about it because you're trying to avoid it, it creates more problems. So there's some situations there. Then this one is particularly negative. If you have a high proclivity for avoidance coping, it's going to be a problem later if you're exposed. Generally, that's what the literature says. And those are the types of forms of avoidance. Particularly, it's worth noting the substance use, self-medication. So we have a unique opportunity in border. Unfortunately, when I first started thinking about this, I went into the literature and went, well, how are people affected by cartel violence? There's been a lot of things happening in Colombia for a long time. There's nothing out there. It's really applying. There's an examination of how policies are changed, or how the economic impact of those things, or at the global level, the psychosocial, the political influence, and how things affect, how cartels affect people politically, etc. But at the individual level, there's really nothing out there. So we have a unique opportunity. It's one of those things where when I was doing the dissertation, I wish I would have had to redo my dissertation because the violence would have ended. That didn't happen, so I'm trying to be now. So I'm trying to make the best of it. So we have a unique opportunity here to look at it. And then we have really limited knowledge of things real time. There's really only a few longitudinal studies of traumatic stress, PTSD, for example. One of them was in Israel where a bus blew up. They just happened to have studied these university students before the bus blew up. They were caught in the bus. Some of them survived, and they went and studied them later. That's the type of thing that's going on. But pre-trauma, we don't have a lot. So we really have a unique opportunity here. The other thing is when you think about PTSD studies, there's some memory distortion. Now, hopefully, a lot of studies ask about something that happened months, years ago. Now, hopefully none of you have been in an awful car crash, but if you have, or you know someone who has, asking them about it 10 years later, which sometimes happens in PTSD studies, how accurate are their recollections going to be? And if you're building sort of these causal models, you really have a good understanding if things have changed, if they've gotten melded in the mind over time. We don't know how much that affects people. Again, as I mentioned, the Veterans Health Administration had to cave to some of these things because other things can influence your interpretation of an event a long time ago, like subsequent events. So if you're constantly very exposed, you have to admit that it's not one single event that causes PTSD. And it provides more refined understanding of traumatic stress so that we can potentially help people more. So the preliminary study, I won't spend too much time, but assessing ongoing traumatic stress. We also assess PTSD, past 30-day acute PTSD. But the other thing I did, and you guys are the first to see this, because when they contacted me and asked if I could do this, I thought, oh, something else I've been wanting to do, and this is an excuse to do it, is look at the individual level symptoms. And I tried, and it's been really hard to find an explanation of what goes on at the individual symptom level for these different symptoms. What is associated with that? People often aggregate the symptoms when they do these studies, so we're going to break it up here and look at how I won't spend too much time on the methods except to say we recruited individuals who frequently traveled to or lived in Ciudad Juarez. They had to be in Ciudad Juarez at least an average of 3 times a week. They had to have internet access, and in particular, I used to do a lot of studies where people would have to carry things around. And I don't want to call attention to people, especially in these situations, so we wanted to do it online. It provides a little bit more anonymity, a little bit more confidentiality. And they had to be, of course, bilingual, because if you're a student at UTEP, to pass the TOEFL, you have to at least have some English capabilities. But we wanted people who we were clear that they could go and be absolutely fine in Ciudad Juarez. We didn't want the person who's going once a month to Kentucky Club, although, you know, in that. Dude, that's awesome. I'm going to come back here next year. We wanted people who actually were part of Mexican society, so that they had some experience with this. One of the things, now, I'm sure when we send this off for publication, there's going to be an issue here. Well, they're students, and that's true, and I'm going to take that on the chin. I'm really actually happy that we did this in students, because during the same time that I had this grant, through HHDRC, someone else was doing stuff in Juarez, and it became, when the travel ban came down at UTEP, during this time period that we were doing the study, that person really had to stop their research. And we had the ability for them, they were still coming across. So we had the ability to go over there and study them. I really debated whether, should I do this at Tec de Monterrey, or should I do this at UACJ? But I'm really happy that I did it here, because not having done that, it would have had to stop and we wouldn't have any information. And they were compensated $40 for their time or experimental credit. So that's the main gist of it. I should say that everything was in Spanish. We had all the measures that, if they didn't already exist in Spanish, we had them professionally translated, back translated. And the one that the main outcome we used was the post-traumatic stress disorder checklist, and for a specific event. And we adapted it to the violence in Ciudad Juarez. And not only that, it was really nice. A lot of people in the lab and in the department talked about how, you know, this is not only just, and since then, I know exactly what they mean now, and I'm sure if you still travel to Juarez, you know what they mean when there's this hostility and just this feeling of occupation with the soldiers there. And if you can imagine, you might not have ever been involved in something with the cartel, but if you have an assault rifle pointed at you or at your loved ones at checkpoints, that in and of itself is traumatic. And that happens to people. It happened to me. And no one's doing anything, but it's this feeling of occupation, and that can affect people. I apologize for that. So we wanted to consider both those things, because both seem to be affecting people, at least anecdotally. And we assessed also past 30-day acute traumatic stress. We also adapted this measure to look at past 24 hour. And it's really nice because participants actually were able to discriminate between the two, as I'll show you, to look at things at an ongoing daily level. Because what they had to do is for 7 days they had to fill this out. They had to go online. They had to just basically report some of their activities. I'll talk about that in a minute. So we could get a longitudinal, more real-time assessment. We also included the life events checklist. This has 17 items about reasonably objective traumatic experiences, combat, assault in some form, rape, as they put it. Basically, whether you experienced it directly or you indirectly experienced it. We also wanted to include depression, anxiety, and stress, because those are relevant factors here, partly because traumatic stress involves anxiety, and you want to co-vary out some of that stuff. And then general stress, because when you think about it, well, basically when you have a stressor here and a stressor there, the nice thing about humans adapt by trying to put things in compartments, because things like this start to blend together, because when you have a stressor here, like you have a final, and you have a stressor here, like loss, and you have a stressor here, my family's really suffering in Ciudad Juarez, I'm over here, I don't know what's going on. It's not that they're distinct. It all sort of falls into one sort of anxiety misery, unfortunately. And so we have to sort of pull that out. We can pull that out statistically, but we also assessed social support critically. The scale typically aggregates dates all these, I left them separate, and they held together pretty well. The family, friends, and significant other is what it assesses. And then problem-focused, emotion-focused, and avoidance-based coping, all which held pretty well together. The daily assessment, so every 24 hours, at least every 24 hours, and because we did this online, we had a documentation when they were filling things out. We could also measure whether they lied to us. These are students after all. And filled things out one after another. And we said, no, listen, you need to do this. Here's the evidence. That didn't really happen at all. Really good students. The students who I love UTEP, but those students who come across from Ciudad Juarez or other Chihuahua, you know, they have to do so much to study in the U.S. And they were really good. They were really good to me. They put up with me. So they filled out for daily traumatic stress, and then also we assessed their objective exposure, so time in Ciudad Juarez. And this is sort of taking the epidemiological perspective, but I want you to keep in mind what comes out with travel to Ciudad Juarez. The reasons for being there. Now, there's actually some debate in the literature, particularly now family, friends, business, you know, reasons for that, like if you work in Ciudad Juarez. Clearly everyone studies in the U.S. who is participating, but one of the things is there's a debate in the literature, sort of, do people who use substances frequently or who use drugs get themselves into situations that are more likely where they're going to have traumatic stress? And I'm sure some of the people here who work with substance users, you know that they're getting themselves in some bad situations, and once they're in that bad situation, they're more likely to have traumatic stress. And then they use substances to cope with that, so it's sort of this toilet bowl effect, unfortunately. But we wanted to assess whether that was a factor for individuals here, even though people are going less frequently because these places are simply just not safe or forced. And then we also wanted to see, instead of the objective exposure, we also wanted to see subjective exposure. Your fear, your helplessness, your hope.
Can you just clarify for travel to Juarez, for number of hours, does that mean hours that they spent in Juarez, or was that the time it took to actually make it across the border?
Yeah, good question. So that's the time they were actually in Ciudad Juarez, as opposed to the U.S., in El Paso or some other area. So degree of exposure within Ciudad Juarez. Does that clarify?
Yes.
Good question, thank you. Okay, I won't spend too much time on this, but oftentimes if you hear about dropout studies, that's awful. This is actually an opportunity in a longitudinal study. We had 20% of people who didn't come back. That scared me at first because we're asking about something that they might want to be avoiding. We might be making them re-experience, and we might be making arousal symptoms worse. We might actually be, by asking about, we might actually be making it worse. So this dropout actually presented an opportunity for me. I just really was happy about this situation, even though they didn't come back. I mean, it would have been great if they would have come back, but since they didn't, we could look at this. And I won't go into the detail because it's pretty intensive statistically, and that's boring for a lot of people, and I understand. But basically, the take-home point after you do all this is that after the lights flicker and this computer model gets done running, you can say, we weren't making things worse by asking about it, which is important. It's preliminary evidence. It doesn't mean that that's the case for everyone. But this dropout meant that for at least the people who didn't come back, it gives us a little security that just by asking about it, we're not necessarily making it worse. So I won't talk too much about that. These are the approaches to analysis. I won't talk too much about that, just in the interest of time. If you have questions later, though, this is the stuff I love to do. So, yeah, we'll sit down. Now, the results. First of all, I want to highlight some of the demographics here, and I won't spend too much time. Here's gender. Residency. We had an equal amount, almost equal amount of people who are residents and U.S. citizens, and this is going to come into play. So people who are in Ciudad Juarez and might be potentially affected, and I'll talk about how they're affected later, they're U.S. citizens. So it's worth keeping in mind this is not just a problem that we can say it's on that side of the wall. The city of residence, majority, Ciudad Juarez, and then it's worth noting here, now these are fairly young adults. They've already had a median of 2 experienced directly, 1 witness, 4 known. That's intuitive here. this is a highly traumatized group, but if you think about the majority of people who experience one in their lifetime, these people are 19, 20, 21, 22. For the most part, you get some higher ages, already two. So it's worth noting that, especially when we start considering resilience factors. This is what I didn't expect. Now, this is a little tricky. Psychometricians make a career out of this issue. When you take the score on our measure that we use for traumatic stress, which is highly validated, it's disseminated by the National PTSD Center. It's considered a very good measure. If you use the civilian score for the veteran score is 52. The civilian score is 44. But that's people who, this was normed on people in the Northeast. So a little bit different from down here. And when you think about some of the things that people on the border have to deal with that people in the Northeast just might not tolerate, people might be a little bit more adapted, so this might not be as meaningful. But if we take this at face value and say score of 44 indicates post-traumatic stress disorder, half our sample have that. That's a problem, especially when you consider these people who have made the effort to study in the U.S., the majority of them, or for the individuals we contacted, the majority of them, their first language is not English. They probably have parents who are probably Mexican born. They had to do a lot to get over here, and so they would be considered what's called very high functioning. And they would be very high functioning from a point of view that they're able to do a lot. They're able to handle a lot. They're working. They're going to school. In many cases, taking care of family members, etc. And they're already affected. So what does that say about people who are more high risk? We don't know yet, but that's really unfortunate. I won't spend too much time on this slide except to say individuals they were breaking up their time about half and half in the U.S. and El Paso, or U.S. and Ciudad Juarez. And then, but it's worth noting that the majority of their connections, if you can see this, the median percentage, the majority of their connections are in Ciudad Juarez, which I was really happy to see because that means that they're more integrated. They're very well integrated in Mexican society. So the last thing here is that score just below 44 when you take the continuous score, indicating a problem. These are the daily things. So remember that people filled out multiple things within days. And so basically splitting their time halfway between each. And now recall that the PTSD score was just below 44 on average. Here is lower. And I was really happy to see this, number one, because it's lower at the daily level. But that means people were able to discriminate between what's been happening in the past month and what's been happening in the past 24 hours. So we really were able to capture not a reflection. If these were the same, there'd be some ambiguities. Are they just recalling the whole past month, what they're affected? But in the past 24 hours, it's some indication. It's not complete validation. But they were able to discriminate, and we have a valid way of tracking ongoing traumatic stress. So here, the way to interpret this is it's kind of tricky because percentages, remember that people filled out multiple times. So the way to interpret this is overall, out of the 819 days that we had, only 19% were in the clinical range. This means that 37% of people had at least one day that they were in the clinical range of traumatic stress. And although it gets a little bit higher there, 52% of people, though, who had at least one day, an average of 52% of their days were above that. And likely what this means is there are some people who are not really reacting, some people who are exposed maybe a little bit more, some people are a little bit more reactive to it, or there's a combination of people who are both reacting to and exposed a little bit more. But there's a group that's really reacting more within this sort of latent class here. I wanted to highlight on this point, the majority of reasons for going, the majority of time they were going for family. So this is not people who are partying and things like that. This is, their connections are the closeness to family. which makes sense. Now, I'm not going to go through these, that, I know that looks really boring. But my point here is to look at, say, the things in orange are statistically significant. They're different from zero, essentially. And I want to highlight, look at all the white. So the things that we would expect and see in PTSD, we don't see in ongoing traumatic stress. An easier way to read this, when you look at non-statistically significant, it's basically zero. We can't say in the population that it's much more than zero, because there's all sorts of variability. So I just set those to zero. Now it's worth it. Now the way to read this is the standardized effect. So this is the impact it has on traumatic stress, or the association it has. So the higher the bar, the more it matters. Now it's worth noticing the white. First of all, female. We see that consistently in PTSD. In ongoing traumatic stress, males are just as affected, at least in this sample. The same thing with resident and U.S. citizen. This is adjusting for all these other variables. And when you look at that, it says U.S. citizens are just as poorly off as people for the U.S. Again, not just a Mexican problem. Let's see. One of the things I want to highlight, this is intuitive. PTSD increases your daily traumatic stress, obviously. And so this is an area where we might be able to work with people to assess that better. There is something, general stress, sort of that balling up of stress. And then this is really confirmation of the traumatic stress construct, that fear, helplessness, and horror really matters. We can't do much about it, but fear, helplessness, and horror. Now, going for business, going for family, and having significant other social support, counterintuitively, on the face value, you say, that makes it worse. Having someone a significant other support you, makes things worse. That's counterintuitive, but I'll talk about that a little bit more, because it's actually kind of not. It's just, we have to consider a more nuanced situation. And the same applies for parent law. It's not that family are necessarily making it worse. It might be something else. I'll talk about that a little bit. With the business, it might be that there is some economic constraint. You have to go over for business. You really don't want to. You just want to stay in the U.S., but you have to go. And that's really, from an autonomy standpoint, that's really frustrating. And so that finally kind of makes sense. Now, here again, boring. This is a little bit easier to read, I hope. PTSD, again, you would expect that association. The general stress, you would expect that association. And this is confirmation of traumatic stress as a construct, that fear, helplessness, and horror. It's nice, this witnessing, which there's a lot of it going on. This, I wonder, and we'll talk a little bit about this, this might be indicative of a little bit of that resilience. People are able to work with it and put it in the right place. This is for re-experiencing symptoms. This is for avoidance symptoms. And again, all this white doesn't seem to matter when you consider all these other things. So covering out all these other things, you can see that significant other support, obviously PTSD, high, family and significant other support, counterintuitive finding, but we'll talk about it in a little bit. It seems to be associated with worse outcomes. Same with business, and then again, support for traumatic stress as it's assessed in the DSM. Last one, boring. So here you have heard about, which you're hearing a lot about, and there's probably talk in this room before about what's going on in student aquatics. So that's sort of this heard about. If you hear about something really awful, it seems to be associated with more hyperarousal, which makes sense. It's sort of adaptive. You start hearing about these things, you start looking out for them a little bit more. And then again, the general stress, the PTSD, significant other social support, again, positively associated with traumatic stress. Counterintuitive, but we'll talk about it. Same way with family. And then avoidance coping, again, there's that negative point, is people are wanting to avoid something, and they're also hyper-aroused. That's why the two go together. So it's really, in good measure, confirmation that ongoing traumatic stress falls within something that's already been codified. So here, just going into the discussion more broadly about the border, people are significantly affected. Even though the president pleasant sample might be what we would say, they're able to deal with a lot. They're fairly high functioning. And so if they're affected, what about for people who are more vulnerable? And we actually, HHGRC was gracious enough to fund me for another project where we're looking at people who are already treatment seeking and how vulnerable they are. If you know anyone who would like, this was actually, I want to take a sidetrack here. On that particular study, we're having a recruitment problem because the criterion, people just aren't going, and we had a criterion of, we have a criterion presently of 1 day a week on average. If you know people who would like to see a therapist, when I was an intern, a clinical intern there, I never had people with a copay of higher than $17, and they never reject anyone because of hardship in terms of copays, and so some people we had their fees waived, and we would see them for free. A lot of people, a lot of my copays were $4 for therapy. And this is at Family Service of El Paso. We have a grant going on where Family Service gets some money and they get a free session. So if you know someone who's affected in some way and they go over to some degree, ask and you think that they might be willing to start a therapeutic relationship, you think that they might be amenable to that, feel free to give them a reference to Family Service of El Paso. We need the participants. HHGRC wants to spend the money. It's been allocated. I imagine they want to spend the money. We want to get an assessment of people who are more vulnerable than these and see how bad it is for them. So if you know someone, talk to me afterward. If you don't know where Family Service of El Paso is, it's right across from Bassett Place. But we have a study going on. We'd love to give them a free session at least once. And then, later their copays can be pretty low if they have a low income. It's 1/10 of 1% of their income. So if you think about a $10,000 income a year, that would be $10. So, assessing PTSD can, when you found that was the association with ongoing traumatic stress, if we do a better job of assessing PTSD in the community, we can maybe do a lot for identifying those people most at risk. And if we identify those people most at risk, then that can help the ongoing situation a little bit more. Unfortunately, some of the things that you commonly see in PTSD are a little bit more nuanced in ongoing traumatic stress. So again, there could be this very strong subjective component to traumatic stress. And so assessing real-time reactions are important. A take-home point on this slide, I would say, is that in post-traumatic stress, there's this issue where people are in a presumed safe situation. So if they're in a presumably safe situation, you can start what's called, for example, if they're in a therapeutic situation, you can start with sort of imaginal exposure, relaxation imaginal exposure, or exposure therapy. And that's all assuming that they're in a safe place. But in an ongoing situation, people have valid anticipatory fears. There's a reasonable consideration that they're going to be in a situation within the next couple hours, couple days, where there's unpredictable, uncontrollable violence. There's fear, helplessness, and horror. And that can be reinforcing some of the avoidance. And so it's really difficult to know how to work with ongoing traumatic stress. People who are immersed in it see it every day. And I'll talk a little bit more about how things are going with that. What's not there should be. Oftentimes that's a really important consideration here. First of all, gender. So males no worse off here, at least in this sample. And then I won't go into too much as to why, but also you found that U.S. citizens are affected. There's no difference in scores between the two. This says it's not, and here it's preaching to the choir. People know this. But from a policy standpoint in the rest of Texas, you have these crusty politicians like, well, why do we need to worry about that? Well, because U.S. citizens are involved. Now, that's a very cynical point of view, because ideally we would want to help everyone in narcotics. But from policymakers, especially in economic crises, it's easy for them to take the attitude, well, that's a problem over there. No, it's not. It's a problem here too. Past and future exposure considerations. So these people are already highly exposed, but in general, those things weren't coming out as associated with daily traumatic stress. So there's evidence for some resilience. The problem with this is that what we know from PTSD studies, especially at the brain chemistry level, is fear regulation systems in PTSD change to a greater degree and to a more extensive degree and differently than in other anxiety disorders. So we don't know the long-term impact of this ongoing violence, and that's something that's really new. I just want to hit this again. So people, they're exposed, but they might be resilient. The majority of people, hopefully resilient, but again, ongoingly re-exposed. What happens? Now, there's a consideration here about what that means, because in meta-analytic studies, people examine this as sort of this linear re-exposure, and what that means is, well, something happens, and then something happens later, and that's equally bad. But if you have something like psychoaccumulation, and you can throw tomatoes at me for that word, but that's what I use to describe this. Yeah, I made it up. Yeah, well, I took it from, so I actually stole it. I stole it in a way because if you've heard of bioaccumulation, so for example, heavy metals in the lakes, fish eat them, then birds eat them, then everything else eats them, then it ends up in us and it has problems. Well, you have the psychoaccumulation building, and people are affected by people with the psychoaccumulation is building up in them, and then you have a whole population affected. So we might have some psychoaccumulation, and the data probably exists to assess this, but I haven't seen it yet. So it'd be nice if you know of people who have been continually exposed. This would be something to look at because it's another way to say there's a real problem here that we need to address resources with. Now, I didn't hit the depression. We had very low levels of depression, which is not, it's great because at least they're not depressed. They're still affected by the trauma. Now this is actually an argument to say, listen, they are separate constructs. You can have one without the other. But oftentimes they do go hand in hand. So anytime you're looking at traumatic stress, you also want to be assessing and considering potential mood disorders. And the same applies for other anxiety disorders. Many people who meet criteria for PTSD will have another anxiety disorder. For example, generalized anxiety disorder. So for someone who's working a lot with that type of population, and this doesn't mean just therapists. This means people in public health, at hospitals, corrections, for example. There's a lot more that might be going on, and they can work together and just sort of blend together into a gigantic ball of misery. And so it helps to consider all those things. And then general stress, and I'll talk about this in a little bit, is one area where we might be able to intervene a little bit. It didn't, and it came through. I'm sorry about that. Let's see. Problem-focused coping is really difficult in uncontrolled situations. And so at the end, again, I'd like you to help me and tell me about what you think might be some problem-focused coping. One that I heard of that I thought was really creative. People develop these adaptive routes so that it's not predictable. If someone's trying to track you, you go and take a different route to the same place every time so that you can at least be tracked. That's an example in pseudohypothesis of how people are having problem-focused coping. Other people are, it's a question of whether it makes students' lives worse, but their parents are checking in with them until they get to the bridge. Are you safe? Are you there yet? And in a way, it's a coping. It's sort of helping them to sort of plan out, okay, what's the best way? I want to monitor if anything goes wrong. It's adaptive. But you're in a much better position than me to know about these things, and I'd love to hear about them if you have ideas. There's also the active emotion-focused coping. It may not fully compensate for ongoing traumatic stress if they have those higher levels of active emotion focus. And then coping, one of the points here, coping in the psychological literature is incredibly diverse. It's huge and diverse. So the take-home point with that would be that are the ways that people are coping in one situation good, but in other situations bad? So over time, for different individuals at different time points, it's highly variable, and that's really hard to track from a research standpoint, or even from a clinician standpoint, or from a public health standpoint. So, but it's worth considering that coping is not probably something that you say, well, they generally do this. It's that they probably do this at this point for this situation at this particular time, so it's highly variable. And when we consider how people are coping, at sort of the state level, it might be more fruitful, both for research and, more importantly, for treatment. And this is another area where I'd love to hear your thoughts on this at the end, because many of you see this type of coping firsthand, not only with people with cerebral palsy or veterans, or, there's a variety of people affected by trauma, and so your input on that I would love to hear. Family familiarity and stability. Now this is my favorite part, sort of getting into this part. The last part of this the presentation is my favorite, and it's basically, it's not just you who's involved when we look at traumatic stress. If you make a decision to move to the U.S., can your family move to the U.S.? Have they made a decision to move to the U.S. and you stay there? So are you separated from people you care about? And that's an important thing. When you think about social support being a huge buffer, if you just essentially feel fine there, that's a huge break in social support. And now you're worried, if you come over here, for example, you can study in the U.S., you're one of these students who can study in the U.S., but your family can't come over. So they want you to be over here, but they're really stressed. So sometimes they want you over there, and you're constantly worried about whether they're okay. There's a lot of stress there. And so the comment, for better or worse, you're in that together. So the other thing to consider is resource loss really worsens traumatic stress. So that's sort of intuitive when you think about, like, in New Zealand with the recent earthquake. If you lose your home, you lose access to something, that's an additional stressor. It makes things worse. Kids, when you think about displacement, kids do a little bit better here from studies on Kosovo refugees. They can adapt, it seems like. But adults who are removed and they're displaced, it really affects them. So when you think about adults who have lived all their lives in Ciudad Juárez, or in the interior of Mexico, or in other parts of Latin America, and now they're forced to go to the U.S. where they may not necessarily want to live. There's a lot of debate up north about how, well, they're growing up in the Midwest, they're taking over. And the reality is, it's so nice interacting with some of the people who've come up from particularly the Puebla area and in Central America, who've come up into the region that I grew up in. And when I talk with them, it's clear that a lot of them just want to go back home. There's actually a joke. I was once at a conference in New York, and I was talking to a bunch of people. I met a bunch of people from Puebla. And one of them was telling me, yeah, I want to go back to Puebla, though. And his joke about New York is that it's now Puebla, York. But a lot of people want to go back. And it's understandable. That's familiar. That's home for a lot of people. Just like El Paso's home for a lot of people here. You grew up here, you want to stay here. And so it's a stressor to be displaced. And then physical resource loss, obviously these extortion, the quotas, and then those are worth considering. People are losing resources, and they're also losing familiarity with systems that they may have used all their lives. So what if you sought health care in Ciudad Juárez for your entire life? You're about 50 years old here. Now you stop going because of the violence. But that's all that's familiar to you. You have your doctor that you're most comfortable with. You're very comfortable with EAMS, and I think, EAMS has problems like everyone else's problems, but they do a lot of things well, in my opinion. There's some lessons we could learn in the U.S. from EAMS. And if people are familiar with that, and then they come over here, there's frustration, especially when you think about all the healthcare changes that are occurring, and people's, are they going to have this or aren't they in the future, given the political system right now. The social support, strongest buffer to traumatic stress post-event. But this often applies to retrospective reports. Well, what helped you most 2 years ago when you was? Well, it must have been my family. Well, we don't know exactly. I mean, I'm not going to say that it doesn't, because I think it does. But we don't know to what degree it impacts people. And it's also potentially more accessible post-event. If you're all immersed in the same thing, it's harder to provide social support. And I'll talk a little bit about that in a moment. But it's particularly hard in uncontrolled and unpredictable situations. And especially in larger families, you have resources spread across a whole family. So how do we handle that? And the last thing, and this is the part I like the most, is are you, when you're in social support, are you a provider or are you a receiver? So this is the traditional model. I don't know if it's easy to read, but that N just means however many people are in your social support network. And the tacit assumption here is that people are providing support to you. And that's sort of how social support is conceptualized. Now, you have a situation where if you think about combat deployment and death of a loved one, well now you're supporting others as much as they're supporting you. Which is good. You want to see this. This is positive. But it also puts a strain on you. And if you're affected by traumatic stress, it's still putting a strain on you, even though you're receiving support. Now, for better or worse, when you think about a significant other support system, what if you have high social support from some people and you're just more of a provider? Well, we're assessing you as if we're assuming that you're receiving the social support. So it's worth considering that you might be more of a provider, even though you're receiving a lot of social support yourself. When you think about that, the finding with the family worsening traumatic stress, and then also the significant other social support, this is where it comes into play, because it might be for these individuals, especially when you're thinking about these young adults, they might first be starting out these relationships. You know, they're not veterans of relationships like many in this room might be. I don't know. We won't go there, but this is new to them. And so if you're starting to care about someone in a way, you know, it's not like these people are not at the age where it's just puppy love. There's something else going on here. And if they don't know how to handle this stress and they're really stressed by this situation, how is it affecting people? So they might be more of a provider than a receiver. So how do we cope with that? And this is where all of you come into play. We can provide an umbrella of community support. So if people are having this situation, this is where we all have to think creatively to provide an umbrella of community support. Now, there's a real opportunity here that came up earlier today. You have the Cartel violence. You have just the range of traumatic stress that you would expect. You also have veterans of OEF coming back. There's a huge need here. And there's also an opportunity. In Minnesota, you drive through certain communities, and they're called STAR communities. It's sort of the Minnesota North Star, is what they refer to it. And it's these upstanding communities. Well, we have an opportunity, in a way, to be a STAR community for other areas of the country or the world. Let's see. There's a variety of ways that can be done, but I want to ask, when I put that star up, how many of you, and if you could just raise your hand, and please be honest about this, how many of you have actually climbed up there? Actually, you can pretty much walk up there. There's a path up there. How many of you climbed up to the star? Okay, there's about 4 of us. Okay, so I'm not saying go and climb up to the star. But like when you're on certain avenues in Ciudad Juarez, even just crossing the bridge, that star comes out, and you've got a really nice view of the star. And even, you know, all parts of El Paso, you have a really nice view of the star. Now, my point with this is, when I say there's an opportunity to be a star community, if you go up and you walk up under there, and hopefully people can confirm this with me, it's not elaborate what they did up there. It looks beautiful from far away, but it's basically some 8 to 10 foot stakes and some gigantic, what amounts to Christmas lights. It's not elaborate, but it has a huge impact. And the reason I bring that up is because, okay, there are these gigantic Christmas lights. It's a few stakes driven into the rock. But look at what it comes out as. And especially when it's over in Ciudad Juarez. If you've been over in Ciudad Juarez, I'm sure many of you have, and you've seen the star. It's beautiful. They have a really nice view of it. It's kind of, so it doesn't need to be elaborate. What we can do as a community. And psychological, psychiatric support is important. But there's a lot in the community we can just do, and this came up earlier, is if we limit mental health stigma and shame, that can go a lot at the community level, at the population level, whatever you can do to say, you're not broken for experiencing this, can help. Promoting autonomy, that feeling of being in control. Now, one thing, how many of you have ever heard of motivational interviewing? Yeah, a fair amount of you. So for those of you who haven't, there's this concept called rolling with resistance. And the idea basically came about, It was actually developed in UNM in CASA dealing with people who are heavy drinkers. So with the heavy drinkers, you know, they want to stop drinking. You get them into treatment, and they're saying here, you're like, oh yeah, you need to quit drinking. And you know, they brought them in here, but when you start to say, you need to do this, they push back and they say, wait a minute, I like drinking. I like taking cocaine. They start pushing back against you. And so the alternative is not to say, well, you need to do this, you need to do this. For these people who maybe don't want to enter into this type of to therapy, you need to allow them that autonomy to say, yeah, let's let you recognize the issue. We're here to stand by with you, but we're not saying you need to do this. We just want to see if you want to do this. And so promoting autonomy is really a critical thing. So just walking, you imagine just walking next to someone versus saying, you need to do this. You know, people won't push back against that as much necessarily. And sometimes that's what will help them to get to the next step if they're being affected. There's also what we have with the potential nuances of exposure. And what I mean by that, well, first of all, I want to say, why can we be a star? These are conflict areas. So certain areas of the U.S., Detroit, L.A., parts of L.A., what's that? D.C. Yeah, D.C. The list goes on, right? Everyone pick a bad city they've been to. Yeah, exactly. But it's unfortunate. Yeah, I mean, you can see there's conflict. And actually, this map was created before, if you think about, this would probably be red, this would be red, this would be red, this would be red, this would be, some of those are already red, but, you know, this would be red down here. I forget where that part of Australia is. But there's an opportunity here to put El Paso on the map and say, you know, you can learn some stuff from us. We have a population here and we're trying to help you. And it doesn't have to be elaborate. Remember, what is the star made of? It's gigantic Christmas lights. But it looks so beautiful. And maybe someone from is there anyone from the city developmental department where they're like, well, no, it cost a lot more than that. and it did, but I mean, the concept is basically Christmas lights. So it doesn't have to be elaborate to have an effect. There are nuances to exposure therapy, and that point of view that I had with this is, you know, if you're in a presumed safe situation and you have these generalized fears, you know, one of the treatments is to get you into sort of this imaginal exposure therapy, teach some relaxation skills. By the way, relaxation skills, even in ongoing traumatic stress, really seem to help. But we don't know the impact of when you're essentially providing imaginal exposure. But then they might go out, and it's not that they're it's an unsafe situation. It's not that they're generalized and they're wrong what they're perceiving. It's actually adaptive to the situation. So we don't know the impact of general psychotherapeutic approaches yet, and it needs to be studied because it could be that it helps people in ongoing situations much more, but it could also make it worse by simply re-exposing them. We don't know, and it's worth considering. Again, just considering that's ongoing traumatic stress. If you constantly if it's not an acute situation, it might be important. Now, how can we be creative about this? And this is where you guys sort of can think, because I don't have all the answers. Promoting predictability really seems to help. What we know as psychologists really helps. People having predictability is nice, but I don't know, and maybe you have some ideas about that. In El Paso, just educating on traumatic stress and letting people know that this is what's going to happen if you encounter someone who is affected. And then streamlining policies or systems to adapt that. Now, limiting the daily stress or the daily grind is really important. Now, in OEF and OIF, they have psychiatrists deployed, so very few of them. But what they're doing is they're not saying, okay, that event happens, we're going to swoop in and take care of this. what they're trying to do is realize that, now that's an approach. I'm not going to say it's bad or good either way. It's just one way of handling it. But the way they're sort of taking is, we can't really prevent like an ID from going off. But what we can do is sort of limit that wearing down of people over time, so that when they are hit with something bad, they're more prepared for it. Now I'm going to ask, and I ask you to raise your hand, have you ever had a cell phone battery die? Probably should be everyone. Okay, if you've ever lived in cold weather, the most essential part of any apartment when you're looking up north is a place, do they provide an electrical outlet for your car? Because it gets so cold that you can't start your car in the morning, so you have to plug the battery in so it doesn't die. And that's an essential part. If you don't have the car start, then you're stuck in -40, -50 weather. That's a bad situation. But we'll go with the cell phone part. That's a little bit more familiar here, thank God. Cold weather is awful. Now, imagine you're in a crisis. You need to call 911, and your battery's dead. Is that where you want to be? So, which battery do you want in a crisis? Take 2? Hey, it's good enough. 2 is better than that. But hopefully all of us want to be in 4. So what these psychiatrists are essentially trying to do, these Army psychiatrists, is say, let's keep you charged up and healthy so that when something bad happens, you have the mental capacity to deal with it. You have the biological capacity, essentially the energy to deal with it in a way. So, how do we address daily stressors, preventing low tone? Are there things in your organization that can be done to essentially limit that wearing down? Some of you probably feel like, well, I could talk to my boss about not doing this, and I feel a lot better. And that's a valid concern, because if it's wearing you down, that is important. And it can also benefit the system. So it's not just the individual we're looking at here. The providers, and you support the supporters. So people are supporting the people who are providing help to someone affected. And it's worth remembering that there's a hierarchy to many systems. So you have people above you looking down. You have to consider the system versus the individual. Because how many of you have heard of, I'm not going to say it out loud, but there's something that flows downhill. There's another word you could replace with that. It just depends on which word you choose. So what do you want to flow downhill? And if you're in a position to help prevent things from flowing downhill that are negative and improve things that are flowing downhill like a clean stream, then that's a real opportunity. Something small, doesn't have to be large. So if there's time at the presentation, which there might not be, I'd love to hear about those things, if you have ideas about that. Now, one of the last things, focus on small wins. Psychologists call, especially the industrial and organizational psychologists, call things, like in corporations, small wins. You know, corporations are these things that trudge along, you don't make a lot of change. And the same thing would maybe apply to government. And and sometimes when you get big changes that happen, people push back. You just look at the current healthcare issue. Some people push back to it. It's a big change. Now, a lot of people say it's going to be wonderful. A lot of people say it's going to be bad. I won't get into that debate, but in any case, if we focus on small wins, those first of all are wins nonetheless. So it doesn't need to be these great gigantic changes. And a lot of what you heard this morning was talking about that. And it can be reinforcing. So if you think about behaviorally, you get a small win once in a while. That helps you to stay motivated to continue doing this work versus, a big change here and then nothing happens. You get a little discouraged over a while if no changes. So small wins are important. So it doesn't need to be big. And remember, it doesn't need to be elaborate. Remember that star, how it's constructed, but it's beautiful. It promotes self-efficacy, and it may promote organizational efficacy, and small wins, of course, add up. So, wrapping up, I just want to mention some of the limitations. Obviously, the threshold for impairment might be different in this group of people for this current study. It also relied on a convenience sample because of large variability intra-individually, something called an interclass correlation in the statistical models. You might have had a little bit low power to detect things, but there are some other things I did to boost that up. The strengths are basically we looked at this at a longitudinal way, which is a real opportunity here. And then we also use professionally backed translated measures. So we tried to use it in the most valid ways in Spanish. Now the conclusions obviously moderate to high risk for traumatic stress, although people are fairly high functioning, if not very high functioning, so we don't know. A lot of other people are maybe more vulnerable or affected a lot more. But it's more nuanced than PTSD, at least from what we know right now. At the community level, we can do a lot indirectly to help. Now, therapy is a wonderful thing. I would have gone into psychology if I didn't, clinical psychology, I would have gotten my master's if I didn't believe that. Although I know some people who are clinical psychologists and don't believe in therapy, so who knows. In any case, that's one part of it. But we can all do a little part that might add up over time if it's a small one. And there are lots of creative opportunities, I imagine, I hope. And so, are there opportunities that you can think of? And I'd love to hear about this after the presentation. And one final note. Now, this is what I presented at the beginning. Now change this to 1928 forward. And you start thinking about the mafia, what was going on in Chicago during Prohibition, and U.S. gangs and how adaptive U.S. gangs are. Cartels are extremely adaptive, unfortunately. And if something changes in substance revenue or substance patterns for them, they start searching for other things. You already see this with the extortions to quotas, things like that. They might start to get into other activities to keep the revenue sources. It's not as though, well, the drug money dried up. Well, that was fun. I'll go become a legitimate businessman now. It's not going to happen. And we already see this. Remember, that conflict map is a lot of places, and they're already adapted. And so now you're starting to see human trafficking. You might start to see, what are the cartels going to turn to increase their revenue sources? Body trafficking for sex, labor, and even organs now. So if you can imagine being kidnapped for an organ, that's a new form of traumatic stress that we're just beginning to look at. It happens all the time in Africa, unfortunately, in other areas of the world. So one of the things that they did, there's a famous sociologist who did a study of a gang in Cabrini Green, and I believe it was in Cabrini Green, in the Chicago area, and he looked at sort of the structure of the U.S. gang, and he was talking to the head of the gang, and this gang member had worked at McDonald's for a long, long time. And they get a manual. I've never worked at McDonald's, so I don't know. I bet someone has. You can tell me about this, but you get a manual and you sort of learn how the structure and the supply chain of McDonald's works. And if you think about the major success stories in supply chains in the U.S., Walmart and McDonald's, that's what keeps them successful in a lot of ways, is they have these supply chains. Well, this gang member just sort of took this and structured the gang as if it were a McDonald's restaurant, and it got really successful. Now everyone at the bottom was really paid poorly, and that's why crack dealers aren't wealthy. But he was pretty wealthy, and it was structured because it was similar to a McDonald's. And so supply chains, really strong supply chains are really important. So if you're understanding this, what they might get into, you can better predict what they might start to get into later. And those people are going to be traumatized if you think about sex, labor, and organs. These might be the kids coming down the pipe. There's something else that's really bad. And it's worth considering those things when substance use, if they start to come to the border more, they get fewer drugs into the U.S. Okay, there's fewer drugs, there's higher demand, but it's not getting across, so they turn to other things. There was a state senator in Minnesota I was once listening to on the radio, and she said, the first thing we say when we pass a bill is, we did what? And it's these unintended consequences. So really good things that might help, say, curb drug use or curb drug revenue for the cartels might lead them into getting into some other things. And so it's worth considering that here in El Paso because that stuff might be showing up here. And obviously we'd like to accommodate that to help those people who are affected in that way. So if you have questions on the questionnaires, please let me know. I can't give them out.